right. Welcome. Welcome to our class here on student motivation. And first of all, I want to let you know that I really appreciate you taking a couple of these classes online while I do my professional development in Columbus. So, all right. So I just wanted to review a little bit first before I go into this idea, the main topic today, which is goal orientation, which is really important. When we are talking about motivating students, we need to understand motivation, and then obviously we need to use our understanding of motivation to gear our students towards a goal. So in class last week, we talked about general approaches to motivation, and we talked about the behavioral approach, which really looks at kind of creating reinforcers and punishments for behaviors. Then we looked at the humanistic, and that was really looking at how Maslow's idea of hierarchy of needs, how we have to think about whether or not a student is dealing with a deficit need, which once a deficit need is reached, then the motivation drops because it's been met, or a being need, which once you have a being need, you continue, it's exponentially. So being needs are far more motivational, but they're also a lot harder to get to, and we have to make sure that the deficit needs are being met first. Then we looked at cognitive, and we spent a lot of time on the cognitive, and we talked about the attribution theory and this idea that depending on whether or not the student sees something as being external, internal, stable or unstable, and in their control or not in their control, that really sort of affects the motivation that they have for something. If something is perceived as being out of their control and stable, never going to change, they're far more likely to be unmotivated towards a behavior. And so it's important for us to keep that in mind. We also talked about in the cognitive theory the idea that students need to be able to expect that they can achieve, and they need to value it. And then the last thing that we looked at was social cultural motivational models, which really look at how if we develop a community of learners and bring people into this community, students into this community, that it can motivate them towards behavior and learning. And we also talked about the danger of putting them into inauthentic participation. The idea they have to have legitimate participation in order for it to be effective. Okay, so when we looked at those, we were really looking at how these four approaches, how they have goals, interests, emotions, and self-perceptions in common. And so it's important for us to think about all of these things, how they interact when we're looking at motivating our students. So right now I want to spend some time looking at goal orientation. And there's four really important goal orientations that psychologists have identified, that education psychologists have identified. And these are the things that motivate students. And none of us are completely motivated in one direction or another. We're all kind of a mix, but some of us probably have some more dominant goal orientations than others. So one goal orientation is somebody who is oriented towards mastery. That is the person who wants to improve and wants to learn new things. So they're kind of the person that's wants to learn for learning's sake, wants to prove that they not prove because that would be more performance, but they just simply want to learn. They enjoy the idea of learning or the new task. The next kind is performance goal, and this one is one that wants to prove. That's why I was wrong when I was starting to say that. The performance goal orientation is somebody who wants to demonstrate their ability to others. So they're highly motivated when their evidence of or their performance or their evidence of mastery of a goal is something that's done out in public. So if it's presentations and it's maybe it's Socratic seminars, maybe it's posters that are presented, those performance goals orientation are people who really like to be able to show others what they've learned. Work avoidant, while it doesn't sound like a goal, it actually is in that work avoidant people like to put as much or as little effort as possible into their work. And so these are the people who you can motivate them by demonstrating how something that they're doing is going to shortcut them. So for instance, if you are going to give them unlimited attempts, but they have to meet, say, a target performance, they have to get an 85% on this test. And you can tell the work avoidant person something like, well, if you do really well this first time around, you don't have to take the test again. Or maybe you can, the performance can indicate those who perform at this level don't have to do the homework or things like that. So work avoidant people, well, it doesn't sound like it would be a useful orientation in the classroom. It actually can be. And then the last one is the social goals orientation, which this person needs and motivates different relationships, and it's in those social relationships where the learning happens. So the social goals orientation person is a very social person, and that person is motivated by things like working in groups or sort of becoming part of the club, as we talked about when I was talking about Frank Smith and his idea of like the reading club, becoming a member of this group of learners. So no matter what goal orientation your students have, one thing that we know for sure that research demonstrates over and over again is that students need to understand their progress towards the goal, so they need effective feedback, which means that they need targeted feedback, which means that they need feedback that's being given fairly quickly. It's not helpful if the student is working towards a task and it takes days or sometimes, in some teachers' cases, weeks for them to get feedback. And students need goal acceptance. It means they need, if a student rejects a goal set out by somebody else, their motivation decreases. That goes back to the cognitive theory that we were talking about with expectancy times value. It doesn't matter if they think that they can achieve the goal. If they don't think that it is valuable, they are going to have decreased motivation. So this means that as teachers, we kind of try to use two things to motivate our students, and that's their interests and their emotions. And so we want to use, we want to increase interest and emotions as appropriate during times that we're attempting to motivate students towards their learning. And what happens is what psychologists call arousal, which is when we use interests and emotions, we want to create a sense of arousal, which is excitement and anxiety. And it often includes physiological and emotional responses. So you'll see that teachers trying to draw students' interests and emotions into an activity, especially one that they value a lot. It's also important to note, though, that there is an optimal level of arousal for most activities. And so that's why simple tasks, you actually want them to be higher levels of arousal. Well, that makes a little bit of sense because those are really hard to get a high high level of interest. So think about things like when you were in grade school, when you did the board races for math. That was because that was a skill, it was a drill and skill basically that you were doing, and it could get really boring and really demotivating. But if you put it into that board races, all of a sudden that simple task, you've got a high level of arousal, and it brings you into the task much more. It's really important, though, and it drives me crazy when teachers take complex tasks and they try to increase the arousal. It's really important to remember that really complex tasks were requiring the student to do some serious risk taking. And so, one of the worst things that teachers will do is they'll create this anxiety around the task. 40% of your grade is going to be based on how you do on this project. Or AP teachers might say things like, well, the AP exam, 70% of students don't pass the AP exam. So those types of arousals can really be counterproductive. We actually want to lower the arousal. Because the task itself creates anxiety in that situation. And so, sorry, my dog just tried to eat my computer, so the puppy just took out my cord. But so those types of tasks, they create arousal in and of themselves because they are complex. And so what you want to do is you actually want to lower the anxiety and demonstrate to the student that this is very achievable. And so when you have a complex task, actually, rather than increasing, you might want to increase interest, but you don't want to increase, I mean, you definitely want to increase interest, but you don't want to increase excitement and anxiety, okay? All right, so we're going to, part of, or a huge part of goal orientation, goal orientation and motivation is this idea of self-perception, how your student perceives themselves. And so the idea here, Bandura, remember I put the picture of Bobo the clown in there because he was the social learning theory. He was the person that demonstrated that we learn through observation and we learn vicariously. And so I put him up here, but a lot of that research sort of then moved into this idea of how to motivate our students. And so what Bandura came up with was this idea of self-efficacy, which is that our beliefs about our personal competence in a given area matter. And we can build up our sense of self-efficacy. We can build up our sense that we are able to be competent in a given area by having mastery experiences, meaning being successful in an experience, by watching other people be successful. That's why it's really neat when teachers use their own students' work as examples. And then also by social pressure. And so that's where if you're in a group and your group has a shared goal, social pressure or persuasion might help that student to kind of develop the sense of, yeah, we can do this and we're going to do this together. So what Bandura came to is this idea that our self-determination, our belief in our ability to determine our own outcomes and our autonomy, the more that we believe that we are in charge of our own learning, creates a greater motivation to learn. And so what this creates is this idea, this really strong idea, and it's really something that I think schools are trying to figure out how to support this research. And I do believe you're going to see more and more choices being given in schools. But this idea of supporting choices within students and recognizing accomplishments. I'm going to show you just a little bit. I had talked to you a little bit about this idea in terms of literacy instruction. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a very short video by Penny Kittle, who is one of my favorite literacy researchers, but her area of expertise is in developing student choice. And she talks about how assigned reading in high schools, just students don't do it in part because they're so unmotivated to. So let's watch just a little bit of this video.
The ancient Greeks had 4 words for love.
Sorry, I get this.
The first is philia.
Even though I do love that ad.
In high school, did you do the required reading?
No.
Like any of it?
None.
None of it?
None.
Wow.
I think I read probably 2.
Out of 3 years?
Me too.
Out of the 3 years, probably 4 or 5. 2 that I can remember actually reading.
I didn't really do it.
Did you do any of it?
Fast Food Nation, I skimmed the first chapter and then I put it down because it was boring.
Probably.
Oops.
All right,
Like
so I'm going to
basic
stop
lesson
there.
about other people.
But her premise of her work, and I think the premise that many of us can relate to, is this idea that because the students don't feel this sense of ownership, these aren't books that they've selected, they're not books that they're interested in, that they don't actually read the books. And so, and probably when you get to the second half, when she's looking at how they fake it, probably many of us can relate to that idea of how we faked our English classes. You know, reading Spark Notes, listening to other people talk, listening to the teacher and spitting back at the teacher. So that's really important, is whenever possible and wherever possible, giving your students some sense of choice so that they can feel some sense of ownership, which, you know, depending on where you are in the curriculum, it's easier said than done sometimes, but really thinking about that. And then the other thing is to really recognize their accomplishments, to give them some sense of accomplishment, celebration, let everybody feel some sense of achievement. Okay, so one of the things that we have to think about is that some people can develop what we call learned helplessness. It was when people believe the events and outcomes in their lives are uncontrollable, they develop this learned helplessness. I found this very wonderful video on this, so I'm going to put this in here.
Have you ever felt helpless?
I'm going to do the same thing as I did before.
PVP, polyethylene glycol, hooves, animal skin, sheep's wool, parabens, artificial colorants, talc.
Felt helpless? This can be one of the most painful feelings ever to experience. Helplessness is more than just sadness. It's the feeling that you can't change your negative situation and that you might be stuck feeling that way for a long period of time. Shaking off helplessness feels like an uphill battle. Even if you have your friends and family who want to help you, you might express your feelings only to hear things like this: "You can do it. Don't be so down on yourself. Just give it a try." Unfortunately, the feeling of helplessness is a belief that you can't do it. This belief may be so strong that trying to believe anything else would seem absolutely ridiculous. Even though your friends and family have good intentions with their encouraging words, the words don't stick. So, in this video, I'm going to be talking about how people find themselves in a situation where they feel helpless. We'll also look at a few key studies in psychology surrounding something called helplessness. There's actually science behind the way that we talk to ourselves and develop a feeling of helplessness. Throughout this video, you'll learn that we have the power to develop a belief that we actually can't control our destiny. But we also have the power to develop a belief that we can and will control our destiny. And that is what the theory of learned helplessness is all about. The theory of learned helplessness was developed in the 1960s at the University of Pennsylvania. Graduate student Martin Seligman, one of my favorite psychologists, was conducting an experiment on dogs when he noticed that they seemed, well, helpless. They were given a very simple task, but many had given up on even trying. What caused this helplessness in these dogs? Were certain dogs helpless, or were all dogs at risk for learning this helplessness? His experiment consisted of 3 groups of dogs. The first set of dogs was the control group. The second set were given shocks, but were given the ability to turn off the shocks with a simple action. And the third set were given shocks without any way to turn off the shocks. So the second set of dogs had control over their shocks. They could push a button and they could stop getting shocked. The third set had no control over their shocks. Imagine what this taught the dogs about their ability to control the environment and remove themselves from a bad situation. Not surprisingly, the third set of dogs learned a feeling of helplessness, that they couldn't change their situation. After the initial exposure to the shocks, the dogs were given a second set of shocks. In order to stop the shocks, all the dogs had to do was just walk to the other side of the room. Just a few steps could stop these new shocks. The second set of dogs, the ones who could actually control the shocks the first time, were significantly more likely to simply just walk across a room and stop the shocks. What's more important is that they were significantly more likely to actually try to stop the shocks. However, the third set of dogs, the ones who originally had no control over whether or not they got shocked, were much more likely to literally sit down and just accept the shocks. How often are we as humans like those dogs? We just sit down and let bad things happen to us. Well, the dogs weren't helpless because they weren't able to control their situation. They felt helpless because they believed they couldn't control the situation. The ideas that I am helpless or nothing I do can fix my situation are based in your beliefs. At the root of learned helplessness are beliefs that you are out of control and that you do not have power to make changes. Just like the dogs in those experiments, we too, as humans, can develop the feeling of helplessness through our own beliefs. But let's dig a little bit deeper. How do you create these beliefs? Let's say you're an aspiring singer, but you hold on to a limiting belief that says you might not be very talented. Deep down, you truly believe that maybe you won't make it big. But you fight this belief by entering a singing contest. And during the singing contest, you start to compare yourself to all the other contestants. You tell yourself that they are more talented and that you don't even stand a chance against them. When it comes time for the judges to pick a winner, you don't even place. When you get home, you tell yourself that you're not a good singer. You use the failure of your loss to justify these beliefs. The more you reflect on that singing contest, you use it as evidence to tell yourself that you're not a good singer. And the stronger that belief comes. Before you know it, you are so set in your belief that you quit singing altogether, even though you love it. Let's take a step backwards and look at the facts. Does the result of one singing contest automatically mean that the people who didn't place were bad singers? Not necessarily. Are there successful singers who have lost contests or even have been told that they weren't very good? Absolutely. Do singers have more than one shot to enter a contest and prove their worth as a great singer? Of course. In this situation, the singing contest is similar to the first set of shocks in Seligman's experiment. You experience a failure, aka losing the contest or getting shocks, and you felt like you couldn't control the outcome. When you face another opportunity in the future to overcome that failure, like the second set of dogs, or maybe it's another singing contest, you assume that you have no control over the outcome and you just sit down. Okay, so now we're getting somewhere. We see the way that our failure leads to helplessness, which ultimately leads to more failure. But the subsequent failures aren't because the helpless person isn't good enough or can't control the outcome of the situation. The subsequent failures come from the belief that they can't even control the situation and the feeling of learned helplessness. So I've got a test for you. Now that you can see the cycle of failures, feeling of helplessness, and more failures, do you actually have control over your ability to break that cycle? Take a minute to think about this. Seligman introduced the world to the theory of learned helplessness in one of his best-selling self-help books of all time, Learned Optimism. Optimists, or people who are less likely to be affected by learned helplessness, are likely to say, yes, you can break the cycle and prevent failures caused by feelings of helplessness. Pessimists, on the other hand, or people who are more likely to fall into the trap of learned helplessness, may say, no, it's out of my control. Here's a secret for you. There are ways to help yourself transform into an optimist or a pessimist. You can go either way. There are ways to break out of that cycle of learned helplessness and prevent future failures and roadblocks. You can actually use optimism as a tool to give yourself the best chance at success. What if I told you that in Learned Optimism, Martin Seligman created a way for you to shift your beliefs and the way that you explain your failures? His process has given many people the tools to look at their situations in a new light and be more optimistic. These explanations attribute to a person's overall beliefs about their abilities and the ability to control their destiny. I dive right into these processes in my new course, The Psychology of Beliefs. I recently spent a few months diving deep into the psychology of beliefs simply because I was trying to help my students reach more success in the past courses that I've created. And I found that what was limiting a lot of them wasn't stuff that I was teaching, it was their beliefs about themselves. So I started researching and testing, and I came up with a simple system to find your limiting beliefs, pluck them straight out of your brain, and to give you the tools to actually control your mindset. If you're interested, you can check out the full Psychology of Beliefs course for under $20.
All right. Should have cut it off at that part. Sorry. It was over. Okay. So, learned helplessness then is really important for us to consider. So we have to make sure that we're helping the students, that we're constantly giving them some sense of optimism, that we're helping them feel that they have some control, okay, in what's going on. That's why things like, that many teachers will say it's not right to like give kids, let them retake options, things like that, maybe gain points back. But all of that can help you from keeping a student from learned helplessness. And in the younger grades, that learned helplessness is really important in helping them to see that they have succeeded in some areas. That's why I go back to always this idea that we need to move away from a deficit mindset. We don't want to just talk about what our students aren't doing. We also want to help them to see what they are doing well. Okay. So the last thing we're going to do is I'm going to give you a motivational poster. In the next slide, there's going to be a couple of motivational posters, and you're going to quickly analyze it. What is the poster assuming about the student's trait versus state orientation, or extrinsic versus intrinsic motivation? How do you know? What do they say? What are the assumptions they're making about motivation in general? Then you can write your response on the discussion board and respond to the post of 2 other students. So I'll put this back up in a second. This will be your homework for this class, okay? But before I do that, just real quickly, I just wanted to show you what is going to be coming up in the next couple of classes. On Monday, we're going to have a student motivation assessment. I will have the scaffold. The scaffold is uploaded and on Leo, so you can use that if you want. You just have to print it out. Your final mind mapping day will be Wednesday on the 26th, and there will be a work day for the growth mindset project on Friday the 28th. Your growth mindset project is going to be due on Monday the 2nd. All right, so what you're going to do then, you're going to look at this poster, kind of just think about what is this poster assuming about the students, about their motivation, where their motivation comes from, their sense of goal orientation, things like that. So these people are poster 1, Maria Blatnick, Jacob, Anna, and Corey. Poster 2 will be Kyle, Jay, Taylor, and Josh. Poster 3, Olivia, Abby, Dora, and Meek. Poster 4, Braden, Madison, Maria, R, and Emily. And poster 5, Christina, Mackenzie, and Daisy. Okay? All right, so I will see you in class next Monday. And as always, if you have any questions, you can email me. Thank you and have a good day.